First off, I want to say that it's a tremendous schus to be able to teach the Rebbe Shluchos, just like it's a tremendous schus to teach the Talmidim and Talmides that you send. Normally in Mayanot, we try to focus on having more interactive learning, which requires smaller classes. Students can ask, the teacher can respond, the discussion can develop, to get more into what the Svarim actually say inside. But B'Shgacha Pratis, this is the format, so we'll do the best that we can. Before we actually get started looking at what's in the source sheet,
anybody has questions, there's pencil and paper on the table, you can just send it.
if there's questions, there's paper on the table and they're supposed to pass them up. Before we get started looking at the source sheet, the Nukuda that this year is going to be about is making Eretz Yisrael real. I'm sure everyone knows the famous saying of the Tzemach Tzedek, Machdar Eretz Yisrael, that by Chassidei Chabad, Eretz Yisrael is not limited to geographic location, but it's something in our nefesh, and that we spread out around us, the people and place where we are. We're living in a time where people are very disturbed, not other people but ourselves. We encounter different things and it enters into our mind, it enters into our psyche, and it can trouble us and it can disturb us. And one of the things that Chassidus teaches us is that for every problem in Avodas Hashem, there's a solution in Torah. And if a person is troubled, if a person is disturbed, if a person is having a hard time dealing with the situation, the Gashmis, there are solutions in Torah. Kamuva in extreme situations, there's other medical types of things. And the idea of Eretz Yisrael is especially relevant in our times, not simply because of the political situation, but because of the things that we face, especially the shluchos on campus and the troubles that they may face. How does a person use Torah for themselves to bring themselves to some menuchas and nefesh? And the nukuda we're going to see is that when one lives within their own inner Eretz Yisrael, then the outside world will not be able to disturb them. Now, we have here 4 different sources. We have a Gemara and a Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, a short Maimer. It's known the Alter Rebbe, in the beginning of his Nesias, he said very, very short Maimarim, very sharp Maimarim. We have a small section from the Likutei Sichos, and a section from a Farbrengen of the Rebbe, the famous Farbrengen, Purim Tafshin Chai, Farbrengen where the Rebbe, the only reason why the Farbrengen ended is that some Chassidim decided to stop giving the Rebbe mashke, but the Farbrengen went all night. Looking at the first source, the context here of the Gemara is that the Gemara is discussing, unfortunately, a couple who disagrees where they should live. One wants to live in Eretz Yisrael, one doesn't want to live in Eretz Yisrael. Who has the right to decide? Who is in the wrong? And in that discussion, the Gemara starts talking about the importance of living in Eretz Yisrael. And it quotes a brisa. In the middle of the brisa, it says like this, very, very sharp expression. Shekol hadar be'eretz Yisrael. Anyone who lives in Eretz Yisrael, doimik k'mish yesh le'elakah, is similar to someone who has a God. They have the Eibishter. The kol hadar b'chutz la'aretz. Anyone who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael, doimik k'mish ein le'elakah, is like someone who doesn't have the Eibishter. It's a very sharp expression. The person who lives in Eretz Yisrael, they have the Eibishter in their life. And chas v'shalom, a person who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael doesn't. Now, obviously, the Pasha Pshat in this and what does that mean is very interesting, but we're going to be focusing on what the Alter Rebbe says. Now, as a preface, as B'Hakdama, many of us are familiar in Tanya. When we learn Tanya, we encounter the Koiches HaNefesh. There's Seichel, there's Mides, our intellect, our emotion. We learn a little more Chassidus, we encounter there's Ratzon, there's our will, there's Tainum, there's pleasure. There's Machshava Dibra Maisa, thought, speech, and action. One of the things that Chassidus talks about, although not so frequently, is that within a person, there's actually 2 different things that are called Machshava, are called thought. One is called Machshava proper, and the other is called the Koyach HaMedama, the power of imagination, or Dimyon. Now, what is imagination, and what is thought, and why are they different? And understanding that is going to be important before we look at the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, because the Alter Rebbe always takes for granted that a person has a deep appreciation of the difference between the two. We know that before the Chet Eitz Hadas, a person, Adam and Chava, they didn't have a Yetzer Hara. How could they do an Aver? It's a good question. Tzarech Iyun for another time. But they didn't have a Yetzer Hara. Once they ate from the Eitz Hadas, they developed the Yetzer Hara. What does that mean, they developed the Yetzer Hara? So the Rambam in Mer Nevuchim explains, and this is elaborated on in Chassidus, that a person has something called Koyach HaMadama, power of imagination. Imagination is the ability to recreate what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we smell. Anything we experience with our senses, we recreate in our own mind. That's where our memories come from. We remember what someone looked like. When we imagine what something's going to be like in the future, we're using what's called Koyach HaMadama, the power of imagination. It's imagery. We think in images, we think in sounds, and these things evoke emotion in us. Obviously, if a person has seen something very scary, and that image replays over in their mind, they feel fear. Disgusting, they feel disgust. Something that made them feel loved, then they feel love. And one of the great powers of the Koyach HaMadama is that it's very visceral, it's very intense. It touches a person's emotions very directly. The downside of the Koyach HaMadama, the downside of the power of imagination, is it's like a small child. It doesn't understand anything. So the power of imagination will recreate images at random. It'll pick a little bit from here and a little bit from there. That's why in English we call imagination to be creative. And they can imagine my bacher with the head of my daughter. Right? You can mix things up. In the Koyach HaMadama, all you have are a series of very emotionally evocative experiences. But they get very jumbled. And the idea that we have a Yetzer Hara is that we start to build a world in our mind based on the Koyach HaMadama, based on images. Like Chazal tell us that a person's Yetzer Hara only has an effect on what they see. If I've seen something, I hear something, I experience something with my senses, then the Yetzer Hara starts mixing and matching those things to play at my emotions, to lead me down the wrong path. Whether it's the taiva to do something asur, or it's feeling fear, it's feeling out of place. But the other koyach, machshava proper, is not like that. Machshava proper, real thought, is something that only human beings have. Animals, Chassidus says, also have the power of dimyan, the power of imagination. And real machshava is for things that are abstract. Abstract means you can't see them, you can't taste them. If you ask a child, is it okay to steal? They say, no, it's wrong to steal. What does the wrongness of the stealing look like? Is it right to give tzedakah? Yeah. What does rightness look like? What does love look like? What does responsibility look like? What does logical look like? These don't look like anything, they don't sound like anything, they don't taste like anything. And the Koyach HaMadama, the power of imagination, really doesn't know what to do with those things. And so when a person's living in their imagination, they can very easily get moved away from these truer things, these more abstract things. So we understand that we have in our minds two things we call machshava. Real machshava, where we use language to think about things we cannot see, we cannot touch, we cannot taste, etc. And then this kind of pseudo machshava, dimyan, where we imagine, we remember, we envision what things are like, and that's very emotionally powerful. So if we have these two things in mind, we can understand what happened in Chet Eitz Hadas. Before the Chet Eitz Hadas, the power of dimyan was meshubad. It was subjugated to the seichel, to the machshava. They had the power of imagination, but it was used the way a teacher uses a whiteboard to draw a picture to illustrate to the class. It didn't have any power of its own. And unfortunately, after the Chet Eitz Hadas, we all know in our own experience, the koyach hadimyan, the power of imagination, runs wild. It takes us to places that we don't want to go, and we don't know how to get out of. And so Alter Rebbe is going to discuss this idea of dimyan, the power of imagination, what it has to do with Eretz Yisrael. Now, what Eretz Yisrael really means, this Maimer doesn't address. That we're going to have to turn over the page and see what the Rebbe says Eretz Yisrael means. But he's going to show us, in this Maimer, the Alter Rebbe, how when you're in Eretz Yisrael, you have one relationship with the Koyach HaDimyan, with imagination, And when Chas v'Shalom a person's outside of Eretz Yisrael, they have a totally different relationship. Okay, let's learn it inside. Kol hadar be'Eretz Yisrael, deimik mi sheyesh le'lekah. Anyone who lives in Eretz Yisrael is similar to someone who has God, has the Eibishter, Chulu, etc. Be'Eretz Yisrael, the Alter Rebbe says, Af hadoime, even the quote similar, meaning what? B'chines hadimyon, this quality of imagination, who gam ken sheyesh lo elokah, also has the Eibishter. What is he saying? He's saying that the word doime shouldn't be read just as is similar to, but it's a thing. It's the doime, it's the similar, it's the part of us which represents things, the koyach hamadama, the power of imagination. And normally, as we just discussed, that's where the Yetzer Hara lives. That's what's devoid of a sense of the Eibishter. But when a person is in Eretz Yisrael, even their imagination, the images, the sounds that our imagination conjures up, evoke a sense of Elokus. Kamasha Kasav, this is similar to what it says in the Pasuk, Biyad Nevi'im Edamen. That how does Hashem appear to a Navi? One of the important things to understand, there's a Chacham and there's a Navi. A Chacham is someone who understands deeply. A Navi does not someone who necessarily understands deeply. Out there as a whole. Get us about this. A Navi is someone whose imagination is guided by the Eibishter. That's why when we open the Nevi'im, we see parables, we see imagery. So we see that this idea of Dimyon, it's not a bad thing. It can be a kli for Elokus. It can guide us in our life. But that's only if you're living in Eretz Yisrael. Ava b'chutz la'aretz. When a person is living in chutz la'aretz, it's not that. Pirush. What does this mean? Ha'hefer shebein nefesh sichli shel adam she'eina b'chinas Dimyon. So we have to understand there's a difference between the rational soul of a person, which doesn't have this quality of imagination. You can think of things which aren't physical. Like, for instance, speaking, language. So what does this mean? When we use language, it's very easy to think that we're just using symbols. You have a word, microphone, it represents the microphone. Watch represents watch. But if you pay attention, we have all sorts of other interesting words. For instance, we have the word if. What does if mean? What thing in the world is if? If is this very abstract relationship. And when a person has a sense of if, they're using a very different part of their nefesh. Their nefesh is sichlis. Right? You can see this. You tell a small child, if you clean your room, then we'll go on the trip. The child doesn't clean the room, says, why aren't we going on the trip? I said, if you clean your room. Doesn't register. Like, you said clean the room, you said go on the trip. We didn't clean the room. What does that have to do with the trip? Nothing. The if didn't register because the if is abstract. Language, real language, not imagery, captures very profound things. Which is why, I'm sure all of us have noticed, in Chassidus, when Chassidus uses mashalim, uses analogies, the analogies are not meant to be emotionally evocative. They're meant to be dissected and analyzed. How does the light relate to the sun? How does the guf relate to the nefesh? Understand it, explain it using language, and that gives you some abstract sense of our relationship with the Eibishter. So that's using something called the nefesh sichli, the rational part of a person. It's also the part of a person that if we always lived from that place, we'd always do the right thing. Aval behema, going back into the Maimer, but an animal, and by here, animal means literally an animal. The Mittler Rebbe, who's known for being quite detailed, he says, for example, this is not a precise quote, but paraphrase, a cow, when it's hungry, has an image of the grass in his mind. Right? An animal also has imagination, and therefore animals also have emotion. Aval behema, ein li rak dimyon b'machshava. An animal only has dimyon, litfeis gashmis mamish. And you can see this play out a little bit if you try to learn something for yourself, or you try to teach something to someone else. Often we need to make a chart. We need to make an illustration. We need to diagram it out. What's above, what's below. Why do we have to use physical space to clarify our thoughts? Because part of us is a behema. And a behema relates to things when they're very physical, when they're very tangible. The dimya needs to represent things in a sensory way. And so we use sensory representations, similar to the way the Eibush does with the Navi. But unfortunately, that's the behema part of a person. The behema part of a person is generally, we understand, not a good thing. It's klipa of sitrachra. Ube Eretz Yisrael, so the Alter Rebbe continues now. In Eretz Yisrael, so zeh shar hashamayim, which is the gate of heaven. I'll come back to know what that means. Yochol yispasha to nevuah ad medrega tachtoinu sheb'machshava. Nevuah can reach even the lowest level of thought, Shu Nefesh HaBahamis, to the person's Nefesh HaBahamis, Shu B'chinas Dimyon, Shu Nefesh HaBahamis, the power of imagination, the Nefesh HaBahamis, Shabbat Adam in the person. What does it mean, Shara Shemayim? Right? We know we're in Sfira Sa'omer, and there's the idea of each day we're counting a different Sfira, and there's 49, and then there's Shavuos, and that's the idea of the Nun Shara Bina, right? The 450 gates of Bina. What is a gate? So Chassidus differentiates, there's a gate, and there's a path. A path you can go from one place to another, and a gate you go from one place to another. But you have a big group. If you had a path, right, it would take you a very long time to get there because each person goes one at a time. It's very difficult to get through. But a gate, a shar, is meant to be broad, and everyone can go in at once. So there are other ways to get to Shemayim, there are other ways to get to Elokus. But they're very difficult, they're very far-fetched, and it's not so easy to get through. When we say it's Shara Shemayim, it's broad, it's open. It's a way that you can go through easily, and many people at once. And Eretz Yisrael is a shar. It's a shar to connect us to the Eibishter. And so even the lowest levels of the person, their dimyon, becomes a kli for Elokus. And therefore even the person's imagination, their daydreaming, for example, becomes a place where the Eibishter is found. As opposed to if someone's in Chutz La'aretz, then the power of imagination leads us in a very different place. And this is what the pasuk means when it says Hashem saves an Adam and the Behemah. There are those of us who only have the power of Dimyon. We all know that life is very, very difficult. We have responsibilities, we have families, we have children, we have people that we're working with. We don't always have time to sit and think deep, abstract thoughts. But our imagination is always going along. And so some people, when we're on a level of dimyon, that's how we're living our life. How can a person who's living their life in the level of dimyon actually serve the Eibishter, actually be free from the Yetzer Hara? How does Hashem save such a person? By inviting them to come into Eretz Yisrael. And this is necessary for those types of people. And those types of people, in certain senses, each person at least certain points in their life, they're not at a place where they can think deep, abstract thoughts and rise above the Gashmias. So there's a shar, there's an opening, a very broad opening to bring themselves to a place where their daydreams, their imagery, is something that leads them in the right direction. Okay, so now, it's very important. What is Eretz Yisrael? And how do I get there? Right? So Begashmias, Eretz Yisrael is a place on a map, and you get in a plane, and so. But what is the Beruchnis? So we turn the sheet over. There's an excerpt from a Sikha. And the Sikha says like this. Eretz Yisrael versus Eretz Stam. Eretz Yisrael, which is called Eretz in general. Whenever the Chazal just speak about Eretz in general, it means Eretz Yisrael, is K'maimer Lama Nikr Shma Aretz. What is Eretz Yisrael? It's like Chazal tell us. Why is it called Eretz? Sheratza Lasis Ritzon Kainah. It runs to do the Ratzon of his Creator. When Chutz La'aretz meant Chutz von dem Ratzon. And Chutz La'aretz means outside the Ratzon. Meaning, Eretz Yisrael means a person who's running to do the will of the Eibishter. Right? That deep down we know that a Yid has a Ratzon to do the Ratzon of Hashem. As the Rebbe would say constantly, Eini Nevresi El L'Shamash Eskaini. I only exist to serve the Eibishter. Or as the Rebbe would emphasize, the Girsa should be more read as, I don't exist except to serve the Eibishter. That living in Eretz Yisrael means a person's sense is, I'm here to serve the Eibishter. In the case of us, Shluchim and Shluchas, it means I'm here to bring around the Rebbe's Kavanah. And when that's what I'm living with, my imagination, my dimyon, will help me have a sense of what I should do, what I shouldn't do, what I should focus on, what I shouldn't focus on. But if chas v'shalom, my ratzon becomes about other things, my ratzon becomes about how do I impress somebody else, how do I keep up with what's going on in the media, then my dimyon's going to be in a very different place. Now, it's very nice, it's very easy to understand that. How does a person really change it? And so for this we have the Sikha of the Rebbe from the Frengen and Purim. And the context there is, the Rebbe is speaking about every Jew has a ratzon to do the ratzon of Hashem. The famous Gemara that chas v'shalom a person doesn't want to give a get, the Beis Din forces them. The Rambam says the reason is because It works because deep down they want to do the Ratzon of Hashem, it's just the Yetzer Hara is compelling them not to. And the Rebbe says that many times people feel that this is not shaykh. It's not shaykh. What do you mean? They look around, they see there's a problem with this person, there's a problem with that person, this organization isn't doing the right thing, that organization is doing the right thing, this person's messed up, that person's messed up. And they have all these explanations of why they're not in a place where they're able to really live a life of Ratzon Elyon. And so the Rebbe says, and the Rebbe uses some very interesting language here, the Eitzel Lazeh, the solution for this. Kefish nisgala bezmanim achreinim, as has been revealed recently, davar chadash b'chachmas harafuah, something new in the field of medicine. And something that's been known in Torah for many years and generations even before. Ma'atipulim achadashim, of the new treatments. This is 1958. Lahazber l'choilas ruach, to explain to someone who's sick in his spirit, we would call them now someone who has a mental illness or some sort of mental health issue. Rahman l'tzan, God forbid. Asasiba she'iviyah se'lamayim v'dematzev, the cause that brought him to this situation, a nikra kan, which is called here in America, and the Rebbe uses English words, nerves, or mentally sick, or emotionally disturbed. Person, guys, maybe for ourselves, maybe for our loved ones, we all know people like this. And you go to a therapist, and what does the therapist do? Helps the person understand what brought them to this place. And by the person understanding what brings them to these states, they get better. Obviously, you don't just tell them. They have to come, it's a process, so they have to realize how they got there. And through seeing how they got into that, they see how they really can be free of it. They know how it came upon them. They know in some sense it's something that they went through. It's something that they can also move past, right? This is what different therapies, different types of therapists have different shittas. But there's this idea. And this is the statement, which brought Chassidus, which was also found earlier Sfarim. Knowing the disease is half the cure. Hainu, meaning, a person needs to explain to the person, what is the reason for the Chali Ruach that we're mentioning now? Now he's not talking about Pashut mental illness. He's talking about the illness of not living in Ratzon Elyon, not living that Eini Nevreisel Shamashas Kaini. How does a person heal from that? A person is not trying to align themselves with Hashem's will, which is our Chachma and our Bina. In other words, when a person takes pride that I live according to Ratzon Elyon, and the Ratzon Elyon is Torah, and Torah is the wisest and deepest Chachma, then they'll be okay. But if not, l'cheinu, mentally sick, then he's, I need to translate, mentally sick. Uka'amur, and as Chazal told us, and the Rebbe mentioned earlier, knowing that this is not something that I'm really supposed to be involved in, taking pride in the fact that I'm supposed to be doing Ratzon Elyon, and Ratzon Elyon is a wise and deep thing, that's something that will heal me. And the Rebbe says that's in general. Then the Rebbe adds, and this is the final point, what is the Chiddush of Chassidus in this regard? Not only the reason why they became sick, they watched too much news, they didn't spend enough time learning, whatever the case might be. Chassidus adds that this is something completely foreign to me. In other words, it's not that I got sucked into something, I got into something that be'etzim is no shaykhis to me. And when a person remembers that all of these things that hijacked my dimyon have no shaykhis to me, and I'm here for a reason, I'm here to fulfill the Rebbe's kavanah, that's already half the cure. Making Eretz Yisrael real comes down to remembering we're shaykh to the Rebbe, the Ilona Dechaya, and each person in their shlichus, whatever form that shlichus takes, we're here to mashpia on the sviva, not chas v'shalom, of the sviva mashpia on us, and the shpa is Torah, the shpa is Yiddishkeit, and not to be caught up in anything else. I wish each and every one of you, individually and together, tremendous hatzlacha in your shlichus.